6:30 a.m., June 6, 1944. A cold, grey tide rolled onto the beaches of Normandy as steel ramps fell, and the sound of surf mixed with distant gunfire under a low, unmoving sky. Why did so many men step forward that morning, knowing they might not return? And what choice, made in silence, changed the fate of that day? In early January 1945, the United States Army reached a quiet, uncomfortable conclusion about one of its own officers. On paper, First Lieutenant Audie Leon Murphy was only 19 years old. In reality, the war had rewritten him. Months of uninterrupted combat had hollowed his frame, slowed his movements, and carved permanent lines into a face that should not have known this much. To some officers, he no longer looked like a solution. He looked like a problem carried forward simply because there was no one left to replace him. By that stage of the war, the infantry pipeline had changed. The army wanted younger men now, bodies that could absorb cold, fear, and fatigue without breaking, men who could still be reshaped by training and return to the line after losses. Murphy did not fit that image. He had already been reshaped too many times. Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, southern France. Each campaign had taken something from him, and none had given anything back. Among the men, they had a phrase for it. You weren't old in years. You were old in what you had seen. The army used cleaner language: combat exhaustion, operational fatigue. Murphy carried the signs quietly. He had lost weight. He bore the marks of illness and wounds that never fully healed. There was no dramatic collapse, no refusal to fight, just a growing sense among commanders that they were asking something unreasonable of a man who had already given more than most. Then came eastern France. January settled heavily over the Colmar Pocket, the last major German-held ground west of the Rhine. Snow erased the landscape's details, flattening fields and softening distances in a way that made judgment unreliable. Forest edges became traps. Farmhouses turned into silent anchors for defenses that had been built patiently, deliberately, over months. German units were not retreating here. They were waiting. Murphy's regiment was under strength before the first step forward. Replacements were young and inexperienced. Armor support was inconsistent, limited by terrain and weather. Progress depended almost entirely on infantry moving across open ground that offered no forgiveness for hesitation. The Germans, by contrast, held fixed positions tied together by careful planning and familiarity with every approach. This was not a battlefield that rewarded speed or bravado. It punished movement itself. Every step forward risked attention. Every pause risked being measured. The ground did not care how brave a man felt. It only cared how visible he became. Murphy understood this immediately. He had seen battlefields like this before, and he knew what they demanded. This was not a place for strength alone. It was a place for judgment, patience, and an acceptance that fear was not something to be avoided, only managed. The regiment was ordered forward anyway, because the war no longer allowed comfortable choices. Somewhere between the frozen fields and the dark tree line, as the first effort stalled and the cost became obvious, Murphy reached a private understanding. The war had arrived at a point where youth no longer mattered, experience no longer protected. Only will, calculation, and the refusal to stop thinking under pressure would decide what happened next. Wars are not won by heroes, they are won by systems. By 1945, the American system was vast beyond imagination. Factories ran without pause, ships crossed oceans in steady rhythm, and doctrine had been refined through years of hard correction. On paper, it was a machine built to overwhelm any opponent through coordination, volume, and speed. But in eastern France, that machine slowed, then faltered. The industrial abyss was not about shortages. It was about the distance between theory and terrain. American doctrine depended on balance. Infantry advanced under the protection of armor. Artillery softened resistance before men moved forward. Each element supported the other, reducing risk and maintaining momentum. In the Colmar pocket, that balance collapsed almost immediately. Snow narrowed roads and locked tanks into predictable routes. Frozen ground limited where vehicles could maneuver, and poor visibility turned artillery into a blunt instrument, powerful but uncertain. Firepower existed in abundance, but much of it could not be applied where it was needed. The burden fell back onto the infantry. Each soldier carried more than a rifle. Winter gear, ammunition, rations, and equipment pressed down with every step, turning short movements into exhausting efforts. Fatigue arrived early and stayed. The ground offered no cover that could be trusted, and progress came in measured yards rather than bold advances. Every movement required calculation, patience, and restraint. Across the field, German defenders operated inside a system that matched the terrain. Fixed positions overlapped and reinforced each other. Machine guns were placed not for visibility, but for inevitability. Artillery had already been mapped to likely approaches. The defenders did not need to see clearly, they only needed to wait. Time worked for them, not against them. Logistics strained quietly in the background. Weather slowed resupply. Units fought on reduced rations and limited ammunition, not because the system had failed globally, but because it could not respond quickly enough to local friction. Command pressure increased as progress slowed. Orders continued to arrive, urging movement forward, driven by concern that hesitation would allow the enemy to recover initiative. On the ground, those orders translated into difficult choices made by small units with shrinking margins for error. Murphy understood doctrine as well as anyone. He also recognized when it no longer applied. Tanks could not go where they were needed. Artillery could not solve problems it could not identify. The system designed to carry the infantry forward had stalled, leaving individual platoons responsible for overcoming defenses built to stop entire battalions. This was the point where many officers waited. They waited for improved weather, additional support, clearer orders. Murphy did not. His experience had taught him that delay under these conditions carried its own cost. When systems falter, survival belongs to the man who adapts fastest, not the one who waits most patiently. German defenders sensed the imbalance almost immediately. They increased pressure methodically. Observation improved. Night activity increased. Probing actions tested American responses and measured their limits. Each encounter reduced already thin numbers, and each loss carried weight beyond statistics. By the fifth day, German commanders believed they had found the breaking point. What they did not see was that the man they thought was worn down had already stepped outside the system entirely, and in doing so, escaped the rules that confined everyone else. The Germans expected the Americans to fight the way they always had. Straight advances measured by firepower, pauses dictated by supply, pressure applied evenly along the line. It was a familiar rhythm, one they had learned to read and exploit. Audie Murphy refused to follow it. He did not try to overpower the battlefield. He reduced it, shrinking the war down until it became something personal, something governed by angles, patience, and timing rather than mass. Murphy moved forward ahead of his men, not driven by impulse, but by calculation. He chose ground others avoided, places that seemed exposed and unwise. He understood that stillness invited survival, but movement invited reaction, and reaction revealed intent. When German gunners fired, Murphy did not rush the moment. He observed it. He noted where fire originated, how long it lasted, and how quickly it shifted. Each burst told a story. Each pause filled in a map only he seemed to see. When he withdrew, it was never retreat in the traditional sense. It was repositioning. He returned to his lines with information rather than fear, carrying angles and distances in his mind. When support was available, that knowledge guided it. When it was not, Murphy adjusted. He reappeared in places that defied expectation, never lingering long enough to become predictable. To the men watching from both sides, it felt as though the ground itself had begun to move. Murphy did not overwhelm defenses, he unsettled them. He used small shifts in elevation, shallow depressions in snow, and narrow folds in the land that vanished at a distance. From the German perspective, fire came from one direction, then another, then somewhere in between. Reports filtered back describing multiple attackers operating with unusual coordination. The reality was simpler and more unsettling. It was one man changing position faster than assumptions could adjust. This approach altered the rhythm of the front. German positions that had once dominated the field grew quieter. Crews hesitated before engaging, uncertain whether movement was bait or threat. That hesitation mattered. It created space. It allowed Murphy's company to move without drawing the same immediate response. Progress returned, not in dramatic breakthroughs, but in steady, survivable gains. Murphy never framed his actions as daring. To him, it was problem-solving under pressure. He understood that predictability was the enemy's greatest advantage. By refusing to advance in straight lines or follow expected pauses, he denied German defenders the comfort of pattern. The battlefield became uncertain again, and uncertainty favored the man willing to think longer than he moved. Within days, resistance in Murphy's sector changed character. Positions remained, but their confidence weakened. Fire came later, less decisively. Observation failed more often. What had once felt like a solid wall began to feel thin, then uneven. By the end of the first week, German officers faced a troubling question. How many Americans were actually in front of them? The answer, when it finally emerged, would do more than surprise them. It would break the assumptions holding their defense together. Logistics usually lives far from the front lines. It belongs to rail schedules, supply depots, and forms filled out long after the fighting moves on. For Audie Murphy, in January 1945, logistics became something far smaller and far harsher. It came down to what he could carry on his body, what he could recover from the ground, and how carefully he could manage time before exposure turned against him. There were no surplus margins where he operated. Every decision carried weight. Murphy treated ammunition as a finite resource, not a comfort. He did not fire to announce presence or to reassure himself. Each round had a purpose, and if that purpose was not clear, the trigger remained untouched. This discipline set him apart even from experienced soldiers. In a landscape where noise often substituted for control, Murphy relied on restraint. Silence became a tool, allowing him to observe patterns rather than react to them. Resupply was uncertain and slow. Weather and terrain made routine delivery unreliable, and forward units learned quickly that they could not expect regular replenishment. Murphy adjusted without complaint. When necessary, he adapted to what the battlefield offered, making use of whatever equipment remained functional and available. The method mattered less than the outcome. What counted was continuity. He stayed effective day after day, never allowing scarcity to force him into desperation. This pattern repeated itself over 14 consecutive days of contact. There were no pauses long enough to reset mentally or physically. Fatigue accumulated quietly, not as collapse, but as background pressure. Murphy countered it with routine and control, refusing to let exhaustion dictate his choices. The numbers that emerged afterward startled those who reviewed them. Enemy losses attributed to his actions alone reached a level that seemed implausible, given the conditions and the limited resources involved. What mattered more than the figures was the effect. Where Murphy operated, pressure eased. Patrols stopped appearing with the same frequency. Observation posts fell silent for longer stretches. Fire that once pinned movement became hesitant, then sporadic. This change allowed American platoons to advance with fewer losses, moving not boldly but confidently enough to keep momentum alive. This was logistics as a weapon in its most reduced form. There were no trucks bringing advantage forward, no stockpiles tipping the balance. There was only a man managing scarcity better than his opponent. By controlling when and how he revealed himself, Murphy forced the enemy to spend more resources reacting than he did acting. German artillery shifted focus repeatedly, responding to threats that no longer existed by the time fire arrived. Gradually, the front moved. Not dramatically, not with headlines attached, but steadily. Each small gain mattered because it came without the usual cost. Officers noticed. Men noticed more. Where Murphy went, survival improved. Confidence followed quietly behind. But nothing in war remains one-sided for long. Attrition cuts both ways, and the enemy adapts or collapses. As German commanders began to understand what was happening in this narrow sector, they prepared a response designed to end it. What followed would decide whether Murphy's run had been calculated mastery or whether it had finally pushed him beyond the margin where discipline could protect him. The German assumption was logical, almost comforting in its simplicity. No man could sustain this pace indefinitely. Fatigue would dull awareness. Fear would slow decisions. Eventually, caution would replace initiative. This belief had shaped German doctrine for years, and in most cases, it worked. The miscalculation of American character lay in assuming that exhaustion always produces hesitation. Murphy felt the shift before anyone explained it. The battlefield's tone changed. Fire no longer arrived sporadically or reactively. It came faster, more deliberately, as if searching rather than responding. Patrols overlapped instead of probing. Routes that had once been quiet suddenly felt watched. This was no longer confusion or irritation on the German side. It was intent. They had decided that the problem needed to be contained, then removed. German commanders concentrated their efforts. Patrol patterns tightened. Ambush zones overlapped, designed to funnel movement into narrow spaces where reaction time mattered more than numbers. The goal was not dominance, but certainty. They expected Murphy to slow down, to cling to familiar routes, to protect himself. That expectation shaped their trap. Murphy did not give them what they expected. He adjusted before the pressure peaked. Instead of avoiding danger, he shortened his exposure to it. He refused predictable paths, altered timing, and appeared in places that no longer made sense within standard assumptions. Where caution would have been reasonable, he introduced brief controlled risk, just enough to provoke a response and reveal intent. He never lingered. The moment information appeared, he vanished again. These moments carried real danger. Fire passed close enough to remind him of limits. Space compressed quickly. Decisions had to be made without hesitation, and once made, they could not be reconsidered. Murphy accepted this reality without dramatics. His psychological shift was subtle but decisive. He operated as if the outcome had already been settled, not with recklessness, but with clarity. When fear loses its power, calculation becomes sharper, not weaker. Each German response exposed structure. Patrol movements revealed priorities. Timing exposed coordination limits. Murphy watched and adjusted, staying just ahead of the pattern forming around him. What the Germans believed was tightening control became a source of friction. Their increased effort created more signals, more noise, more opportunities to be misread and exploited. This countertrap strained the defenders. Resources were committed heavily to one narrow sector, reducing flexibility elsewhere. Men grew uncertain. The sense that they were reacting rather than controlling settled in quietly but decisively. Confidence eroded not through defeat, but through exhaustion of certainty. By the 13th day, resistance in the sector changed again. Fire diminished not because positions were gone, but because will had thinned. German activity collapsed unevenly, leaving gaps that had not existed before. Only then did higher command begin to understand the pattern emerging from reports that no longer aligned with expectations. What they were witnessing was not chance, and it was not doctrine. It was the consequence of underestimating a man who had already accepted the cost of his own exhaustion, and in doing so, removed it as a weapon from the enemy's hands. Armies are built on reports. Maps, summaries, timelines, and estimates move upward through layers of command, shaping decisions far from the ground. Most of the time, those reports are trusted until proven otherwise. But there comes a point when words stop being persuasive. That point arrives when numbers refuse to align with expectations. In Murphy's sector, that moment arrived quietly, buried in routine paperwork, and then spread unease through every level that reviewed it. After action reports began to show a pattern that made little sense. Enemy losses were far out of proportion to the size and strength of the American units involved. Gains were being made without the level of expenditure normally associated with such terrain. Positions were being vacated without direct pressure. The figures did not match doctrine, and they did not match previous experience. At first, they were questioned. Then, they were rechecked. Then, they were confirmed. German withdrawals told the rest of the story. Defensive points that had resisted earlier advances were simply empty, not destroyed, not overrun, abandoned. Equipment left behind. Fields of fire left unused. This was not retreat under fire. It was disengagement driven by calculation. German commanders had decided that holding certain ground no longer made sense given the cost, even though American strength in the area had not increased. Attention turned naturally to the officer at the center of those reports. Murphy's condition stood in stark contrast to the results attributed to him. He was wounded, he was exhausted. He had been operating without meaningful rest for nearly 2 weeks, yet he continued to lead, not from safety or distance, but through presence and judgment. There was no dramatic declaration of heroism attached to his actions. The record showed only consistency under pressure. Commanders began to walk the ground themselves. They traced movement routes, examined firing positions, and tried to reconcile what they saw with what they knew. Many of the locations made no sense when viewed through traditional assumptions. Angles seemed too narrow. Distances felt uncomfortably close. Positions appeared exposed rather than protected. And yet, when taken together, they formed a pattern that explained the reports better than any official doctrine could. The realization settled slowly but firmly. The system had not produced these results. It had supported them, enabled them, and recorded them, but it had not driven them. What had happened in this sector was the product of individual adaptation layered onto experience earned the hard way. It was a reminder that even the most refined system relies on human judgment at the point of contact. Recognition followed, formal and immediate. Recommendations moved upward without resistance this time. There was little debate left to have. The numbers spoke clearly, and they spoke for a man who had exceeded reasonable expectations while operating inside unreasonable conditions. Yet even as acknowledgements took shape, there was an unspoken understanding among those who read the reports carefully. Moments like this did not conclude cleanly. They left marks. They followed men home. Wars did not end when ground was taken or positions were abandoned. They ended when consequences were carried forward. Murphy would leave this battlefield behind when the snow finally melted, but the weight of what those numbers represented would not fade as easily. The moment of realization belonged to the army. The consequences would belong to him. Audie Murphy left the war alive, and even that fact felt improbable to those who knew how close he had come to the edge. He also left the war changed, though not in ways that could be measured on a map or written into doctrine. His legacy was not about territory gained or tactics adopted. It was moral, personal, and unsettling. His story forced the army and later the public to confront the limits of systems and the frightening reach of individual resolve when it is pushed far enough. After the war, recognition came quickly and in overwhelming measure. Murphy became the most decorated American soldier of the Second World War. His record studied and celebrated as proof of courage under pressure. Medals followed ceremonies, and ceremonies followed headlines. To the public, he became a symbol of triumph, a young face representing endurance and success at a moment when the country was eager for heroes who had survived. But recognition could not translate experience back into simplicity. The personal cost emerged more slowly and with less ceremony. The war did not end cleanly for Murphy when the shooting stopped. Nightmares followed him home. Old injuries lingered, shaping daily life in quiet, persistent ways. The strain of constant vigilance did not vanish with peace. It simply lost its context. Like many who had carried too much responsibility too early, Murphy discovered that survival and relief were not the same thing. His story carried an uncomfortable lesson. Lone mastery can change outcomes, sometimes dramatically. It can stabilize collapsing situations and open paths that systems cannot reach in time. But it extracts a permanent price from the person who carries it. Experience accumulates faster than healing. Skill sharpens while innocence disappears. Murphy's success did not contradict this truth. It confirmed it. History often prefers clean narratives. It celebrates decisive moments and clear victories. Murphy's legacy resists that simplicity. He was not too old in years. He was too experienced, shaped by campaigns that demanded constant adaptation and emotional endurance. The 14 days in France did not create that experience. They revealed it, compressing years of accumulated strain into a single stretch of sustained judgment under pressure. The enduring truth of his story is not about numbers, impressive as they are. It is about how war measures age differently. It does not count birthdays. It counts exposure, responsibility, and loss. By that measure, Murphy had aged far beyond his years, long before January 1945 arrived. The army would remember his numbers because institutions rely on records to explain success. The public would remember his medals because symbols help close difficult chapters. But the battlefield remembered something else entirely. It remembered the moment when one exhausted man demonstrated that character, when stretched beyond comfort and safety, can become a force no enemy can fully anticipate or prepare for. If this story stayed with you, it's because it belongs to more than just the past. These moments only endure when they are remembered, shared, and carried forward by those willing to listen. Passing it on keeps their sacrifices from fading into silence. Before you leave, consider this one question and answer it honestly in the comments. If you had stood there that day, what would you have carried with you for the rest of your life?